Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 258. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today. I can say for the first time, I've got a co-host on the podcast today. That is Mr. Jordan Tyrer. Jordan, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. No, about time.
This could be a bit of a trend, so get used to Jordan's face. He could be joining us on a few others. But when I was telling Jordan about who was going to be on the podcast today, he didn't just request; he insisted that he came on the podcast because I know he's got a lot of questions for this guest, and that is Dr. Sean Cumming. Sean, how are we doing?
Very well, thank you, and I hope I've got a lot of answers. So,
no pressure at all, no pressure. Sean, just kick us off. We always start the podcast in the same way. That's about you and your background. So, can you give us a bit of a rundown on yourself and your career so far?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of paediatric exercise sciences at the University of Bath. I've been here at Bath since 2006, doing a lot of work on growth and maturation, not just in the context of sport, but also in relation to exercise behaviours as well. Prior to there, I was at the University of Washington in Seattle doing a postdoc, and prior to that, I did my PhD at Michigan State University, and it was there where I was really first exposed to the subject of growth and maturation. I'd done a lot of developmental psychology through my undergraduate, but in terms of how children grow and mature and how some are early and some are late, etc. I never really explored that. And I was very fortunate that my boss at that time at the Youth Sport Institute in Michigan State was Professor Robert Molina, who's largely considered the expert in this area. So it was a fantastic opportunity to learn from him and also start to look at some of the questions which hadn't been addressed yet in sport, because people have been studying growth and maturity in athletes for about 3 or 4 decades, but in terms of the actual application of this information, it's only recently that we've really sort of started looking at the applied consequences of it.
Brilliant. And then talking about growth and maturation, I don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but I thought it'd be quite nice to start on a bit of a broad summary of what you mean by it, but also the impact it can have on our practice as well, especially for anyone working in academies. So can you start us with that?
Yeah, so if we talk about growth and maturity, we often use them interchangeably in conversations, but they are distinct terms. When we're talking about growth, we're talking about changes in body size. It could be changes in stature, changes in mass, but also could be changes in body composition. And for most people, certainly changes in stature will end at adulthood, but our bodies continue to grow and develop otherwise, beyond adulthood, particularly if we look at mass or changes in body composition. Now, the most common things we'll be looking at in academies in terms of growth would be obviously height, the weight that a child is at a particular time, but also if we're taking serial measures, which we do across the academy system, we can then get growth velocity, which is really useful in terms of understanding whether a child is growing during childhood or maybe when they've entered periods of rapid growth, such as adolescence. So in childhood, for example, children are usually growing about 4 to 5 centimetres per year. There's limited disruption at that point, and the majority of this sort of developmental investment is in terms of neural development. It's all about the brain and learning and skills at that point of time. But all of a sudden we hit puberty, and of course we see that increase. Typically, if we're plotting it over a long period of time, we'll see hitting a maximum peak of about, say, 12 centimetres in terms of growth per year. But when we actually measure much, much more regularly, we can see anywhere up to 20, 25 centimetres per year in terms of rates of growth, because growth can be quite episodic in some ways. We get some rapid periods followed by sustained periods where there might not be a lot of growth. And of course, if you average it out, it gets to about 12 centimetres, but for some kids, it can be very, very rapid. When we look at maturity, we're talking about progress towards the adult state, so going from conception all the way through to adulthood. So it was a clear start and an end point. Now, as scientists, we typically define it in terms of stage, tempo, or timing. When we talk about stage of maturity, we're talking about, well, where is an athlete in terms of the maturational journey? Are they, say, pre-puberty? Are they in the middle of puberty? Or are they post-puberty? So it's where you are on that stage. In contrast, when we look at things such as timing, it's whether or not a certain event occurs early or not for a child. So we might look at something such as, say, peak height velocity. For some children, that will occur very early. It might be at, say, 10 or 11 years of age, but for other children, it might be 15 or 16 before they hit it. And of course, this whole concept of timing is incredibly important because not all children mature at the same age. And so within age groups, you'll get 5 to 6 years biological difference between some of the kids, with some maturing early, some maturing late. And that's largely been the focus of most of, certainly the early research in sports science. And it was showing that those kids who often mature early have distinct advantages over the kids who are late. And again, timing of maturity, kids got no control over it. It's largely about 60 to 80% genetic and maybe some environmental factors kicking in there as well. And the last one we talk about maturity is maturity tempo, so which is the rate of maturation. So it's how fast a child is maturing. And as I said, certain periods of time like puberty, it might be quite rapid, some of those changes. And of course, some of the work that Eric Vick has shown has actually shown that maturity tempo can actually be quite closely related to injury rates in young boys, particularly in football, where those boys who are maturing more rapidly are more susceptible to certain types of injuries, the growth-related injuries, the apophyseal type injuries. So growth is all about changes in size. Maturity is about progress towards the adult state. That's kind of how we define it in science.
What a brilliant breakdown. Now I know how we got him on, Jordan.
Yeah.
That's brilliant, Sean. Now that gives a really, really good insight. And it's obviously something that we're going to go into more detail on. But what I wanted to start on is, with that in mind, obviously we're dealing with a lot of players that are at different rates of growth, like you just mentioned, and maturity. So for coaches out there listening that have got a group of players, all these different players at different points, what would be some of the key advice you give them on handling that group with such a mix of level of maturity and growth?
Yeah, the first step is really awareness. So being educated to know that there are differences out there. And I think most people can think back to their own experiences and know that certain boys matured early, certain boys matured late. And sort of understanding the implications of that. Those early maturing boys will naturally be bigger, stronger, faster. They're the kids who kind of go box to box in an under 13 game and just push everybody out of the way. And while that might get them success at that kind of stage and may identify them as being the best athlete, the problem is that they will also stop growing earlier too. And so there's limitations in their development if they don't work on the technical and tactical and they just rely on physical. So certainly being aware of those differences and how the late developer might be technically a fantastic player but may struggle to compete physically. That's the first step, is an awareness of those types of differences. Being able to pick out those differences. If you understand what you're looking for and some of the changes that occur during puberty, you can pick out and eyeball a kid and get a pretty good idea of who is an early maturer, who is a late developer. So if you're looking at your, say, 12-year-olds, 13-year-old, and you got one kid who's got big old torso, broadening of the shoulders, you see the elongation of the face, squaring of the jaw, etc. That's the classic signs of going through puberty. The late developer, they're usually all feet and legs at that point of time, because growth in puberty typically is largely in the torso. They haven't put on that lean mass. They got the wee round face like a kid at that point of time, and of course the high squeaky voice. So if you know what you're looking for, you can pretty much eyeball a kid and say, yeah, that kid's early, that kid's on time, and that kid is late. But certainly having an awareness of it and the challenges that both the early and late maturer may face, and being able to adjust for those, maybe playing that early developer up to get them that extra challenge so they don't just rely on their physicality. With some kids, it might be a case of playing them down. That might be the appropriate challenge for them at that point of time, particularly if they're not getting the touches, not getting the game time, or just not being able to physically compete within their own particular age group. So an awareness is certainly the most important thing. You can actually take measurements on kids if you have heights and weights on kids, and if you're taking it on a regular basis, maybe every 3 or 4 months or so, we can get information which will tell you who is on time, who's early, who's late, what stages of their development that they're in. The methods that we use in our research is a method called the Roche method, works on percentage of predicted adult stature. Well, Jay Salter has done a really nice job of putting together an Excel sheet which will allow you to put that information in over time and actually track your players and get all that information. And the only key things you need is mum and dad's height for the biological parents, and that can be self-reported if you want, or you can measure them. And then if you get the players' heights and the players' weights, and you got the date of birth and date of assessment, you can get all that information quite readily. And I know Des Ryan, who was at Arsenal, who's now working with Setanta College in Ireland and doing some wonderful work with the GAA, has actually implemented a number of sort of growth and maturity screening programs across their GAA Gaelic sports programs. And again, not huge investment to resource there, but still really being able to evidence best practice in terms of measurement and monitoring and application of growth and maturity.
You were chatting, or we were chatting before we started recording, about some of the players as well that have been late maturers, and it's amazing, isn't it, when you start delving into it, about some of these players that could have potentially not come into the professional game because they could have been overlooked. So that's the importance of it, really, isn't it?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think every club that I work with has got a story of a player that they had on their books that they let go, and they felt that they were too small, and eventually they've gone on, they've developed. But it does make you wonder how many clubs have lost players that never came back to the system, who chose, okay, well, football wasn't for them at that point of time. And this was certainly a big push when we started doing our work with the EPPP and the Growth and Maturity Screening Programme, putting it across. Initially, our concern was about losing those late developers, maybe not keeping them in our system. And so a lot of work was invested in that particular area to try and identify those talented players. But equally so, as I said, certainly with the work in the biobanding, we're also looking at those early developers and realizing that they're actually shortchanged in the system too. Because often, we invest heavily in them, but actually we don't push them or challenge them enough to actually have the skills that are going to be required at the top level. And so with the growth and maturity, it's not just about the late developers, it's all about those early on time and late developers and supporting them as effectively as you can.
I think it's a perfect time to bring Jordan in, because Jordan's been in an academy most recently that's experienced this, and he's done a lot of work in this area as well. So Jordan, I know you've got something around biobanding to ask Sean.
Yeah. No, this is why I was so excited to hear you was on, Sean. For the context of people listening, obviously I was at Bournemouth, and as a club and as an academy, they're very heavily invested in biobanding. Certainly my predecessors, David Johnson and Ben Bradley, they've been doing a lot of work with yourself, Sean. So really, really interested. And certainly one of the reasons I joined Bournemouth was because I really, really believe in growth and maturation and individualizing and biobanding and making things right for the kids. So anyone listening kind of wondering why I was so excited, this is why. And I've seen firsthand the experiences of watching academy players when they're put into biobands excel and be faced with new challenges and overcome those challenges, and just see how academy footballers, it can literally change just by changing the age groups they're into biobands. So the questions I've got loads of questions, by the way, Sean, but I'll try and keep them short. Those are going to be here all afternoon. But firsthand we saw coaches fully buy in when they saw biobanding for the first time. They went, wow, this is a really powerful tool. At Bournemouth we saw players and actually parents as well really, really buy into it. So last season, I'm just going off my experiences, when we did our one of our final blocks of biobanding, we also put out a questionnaire to all the players, all the parents, and kind of asked them their views. Did they think it was worthwhile? Would you like to see more of it? Would you like to do more of it? And it was overwhelmingly positive. Parents, there was one parent, I even remember the answer, that said, can we actually do kind of a full term, school term of biobanding rather than just weeks? So again, context for listeners, clubs are doing weeks worth of biobanding and then biobanding fixes at the end. But I will get to a question. My question for you, Sean, was really that I felt firsthand that everyone in the club who was seeing biobanding for the first time, or had seen it many seasons now, could see its value, believed in the value. Why is there still some clubs that haven't uptaken biobanding, do you think? Because that was always our challenge. We could bioband in-house for the week, and we always wanted to finish the weeks when we did our biobanding weeks with a fixture against another academy, against another club. And there were some clubs which were always keen. I can Southampton, Reading, Exeter were really keen. QPR did with us as well, and there's plenty more. Arsenal as well, like you say, previously with Des Ryan. But we struggled with quite a few academies that say, oh no, we're not really doing that. And you speak to sports scientists and they'd say the same thing. And do you think there's a way we can integrate it better? Do you think it's going to need to be, tick boxed, like you mentioned the EPPP? Is it going to require them to say you need to be biobanding now in order to meet category status? How can biobanding be uptaken a bit more widespread?
Yeah, I think it needs to be voluntary. If the coaches or the club don't see any benefit, then there's no real point pushing it on them, because they're probably not going to apply themselves and probably see the benefits. So it needs to be something where the clubs have an invested interest in it. When we first started doing it, the program and the ideas actually came from the clubs. It was James Bunce, who was working with the Premier League. He was in conversations with likes of Stoke, Southampton, Norwich, and a number of the clubs had approached him and said, look, could we have some games where we actually group the kids by their biological ages rather than just their chronological ages? And again, the biobanding should never be seen as a replacement for age group competition. The late developers do enjoy that struggle. The early developers do have some benefit in terms of having the chance to succeed. But it's something that should sit alongside age group competition as part of a diverse games programme. I think this is what the Premier League actually do quite well. When Dean Smith was in charge of the games programme, they had player-led festivals, out-of-balance competitions, power play futsal, age group, bio-banding. And I think the nice thing about this was that it presented a variety of different learning situations for the kids. So they're not just getting the same old age group competition all the time. And I think what would probably help would be if, say, for example, the Premier League maybe with their games program decided, okay, there's going to be certain weeks or certain time periods where we allocate to certain types of game formats, and it might not be bio-banding, it could be player-led festivals. But what would be neat, I think, would be if the clubs could actually identify what their developmental needs were for, say, their under 13s, under 12s, under 14s, and they could actually then match up the different game formats, whether it be age group games, whether it be bio-banding, whether it be player-led festivals, etc., relative to those needs. Almost like you've got an artificially intelligent kind of games program that basically does a sort of a big audit of all of the various clubs, and then matches clubs up together who are seeking sort of similar types of learning opportunities for their players. With regards to the resistance, there were definitely some clubs who had no interest in it whatsoever, and that was fine. What we would often get back from them were things such as the logistical side of things, and that was definitely a challenge for many clubs. The whole idea of organising kids coming in at different days for practices and can cause a little bit of a logistic headache, but it is definitely something that can be overcome. There were also some clubs out there who were kind of championing the whole kind of talent needs trauma kind of philosophy that, oh, if you were a late developer, you were good enough, and you had to survive anyway. This would be good for you in the long term. And while, yeah, some late developers will survive, most of the clubs actually don't have any late developers in the system whatsoever. So it's hard to benefit from that challenge if you're not even in the system. Yeah. And on the flip side, you can look at the early developers and say, actually, well, those boys aren't getting the challenge that's going to be necessary. And often they don't end up meeting their expectations because they haven't been challenged. They've just relied too much on the physicality. Some of the clubs as well would say, oh, no, we can't play players down because that creates stigma and it'll be bad for them. They get a concern about playing down. And one club in particular, I've had two of their coaches flag that up during FA education sessions. And they said, look, we're losing our best players because the club will not allow us to play these players down in age group because they're worried it will create social stigma for the kids. And he says the problem is, as I said, we're losing our best players to other teams because often it's those late developers. And it was one of the coaches from Tottenham threw up his hand at the same session. He says, look, two of the boys in our first team played their entire academy down. So we will identify the names of those players and say, oh, you're on the so-and-so pathway. He said, you know, Southampton could do the same with the Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain pathway, or with Jesse Lingard. I think Jesse played 2-3 age groups down. I think it was 2 age groups down, I think he played. And again, he was still one of the smallest boys. You could identify that. God, even Messi played down when he first came to Barcelona too. So playing down should not be seen as a barrier to activity. In fact, you know, it should be part of a diverse games program where you play up and you play down to get different types of challenges at different points. And as long as you educate the players that playing down actually isn't a bad thing, and this is a good way of exploring new challenges, and equally playing up is important too. If you can do that, and you can educate mums and dads that this is an important thing, then it's not seen as being quite as bad. Chatting with Bob Broaways recently from the Belgian FA, they've completely taken the word playing up and playing down out of their language. They talk about playing across age groups now because they recognise the up and down suggests good, suggests bad. So they talk about playing across and the different benefits of playing across. And there's no doubts about it. When we do these studies, both the early and late developers benefit from it. But in terms of those types of clubs, you know, it's got to be something they want to do. You know, there's no point forcing a strategy on a club or anything like that. So I wouldn't put it in as part of policy. It's for those clubs who are forward thinking and see the benefits. And of course, it's often those clubs who are the most successful in terms of producing young players. And eventually what happens is other clubs pick up their ears and go, actually, maybe we should try this. Let's give it a go. And if it works for them, fantastic. If it doesn't work for them, they can walk away. They can look at other things. And again, what works for bio-banding at Arsenal is probably very different from what's going on at Southampton. It's very different from Bournemouth too. So I see challenges and I recognise those challenges, but I don't see how any of them cannot be overcome with education or good planning.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the education side of things. And the Jesse Lingard photo came straight back to my mind. I've given exact those presentations on bio-banding growth maturation, while we're tracking it, while we're monitoring it, while we're using bio-banding in the academies. And that Jesse Lingard photo, I think it's against Roma, the one that sticks in my mind. You know, he is so small and slight in comparison to these Italian kids, and it does put the context there. And like you said, there's so many high-profile examples. Do you think
Yeah, just to add on the Jesse story, I know that Ferguson, when he was there, because Mandy Johnson was doing all the growth and maturity screening there, and he was at least 2 to 3 years biologically younger in this cohort. A number of the Man United players were actually flagged up as being quite late developers. But Ferguson took him aside and he says, look, you're not going to be playing for Man United until you're 21 years of age, because that's how long it's going to take you to grow at this kind of rate. And for some boys, it will be that case, but we see real talent in you. This is why we are actually playing you down at this point of time, because it's an appropriate challenge for you. And Ferguson talks about this specifically in his book on leadership, about the biggest error they could make in talent ID was to have a late developing talented boy just released because they won a big at that point of time to the expense of a big boy. So yeah, really good example, Jesse, there.
Yeah, and I think, again, like you say, it does require sometimes that input, doesn't it, from somebody, you know, experienced like Sir Alex Ferguson to say, this just hold on, give him a bit of time. When you talk about, just go back to your education side of things, do you think, because I know certainly Bath students, and I know there's a lot of students around the country now on sports science degrees where growth and maturation and the importance of it is starting to come in, do you think there's something else there for students in terms of when they're going into clubs as sports scientists or strength and conditioning coaches? Is there a way they can upskill themselves? Is there something that they need to be doing? Should it be widespread as sports scientists now? And you know, when they then step into an academy or a club, they're like, this is an important thing. And if we're at a club that we're not doing it, can we look at introducing it or anything like that?
There's not many unis who have academics who are really studying growth and maturation. There's probably a slight increase now. A place I'd really highlight as being excellent practice is Cardiff Met. You got John Oliver and you've got Rodri Lloyd doing some fantastic work in the area of child development, long-term athletic development, both incredibly knowledgeable on growth and maturation, and certainly at the graduate level, some of the best students in this particular area are coming out of their cohort. We've obviously been very lucky with the PhD students, Megan Hill, David Johnson, Tachel, etc., who've been working with us at Bath and are coming out, sort of applying this work in the real world context. Siobhan Mitchell also doing this kind of work in ballet. And the Bath, certainly undergraduates, they get plenty of growth and maturation. So they're fairly well versed on the subject and the potential benefits of it. But likewise, there's probably other universities where they're teaching the subject, but telling them that, yeah, this is a lot of nonsense and it's a terrible thing to do. So I guess it largely depends on who's teaching, you know, what their perception in terms of growth and maturity by banding is. We do see a lot of confusion out there to some extent, particularly with the relative age research. A lot of academics still can't figure out the difference between relative age and biological maturity. I had one recently commenting that biobanning was a misplaced solution for the relative age effect, and I'd have to 100% agree with that, because it's got absolutely nothing to do with the relative age effect. Relative age and biological maturity are completely different concepts. But this is the problem: if you've got a bunch of academics who really don't have much of a background in child development or studying growth and maturity, they pick up a concept such as relative age and they just assume older must be more mature. And if we think about that in terms of, say, 0 to 18 years, yes, undoubtedly there's going to be a strong correlation. But if we look in a single year age group, the correlation between relative age and maturity is about 0.2, 0.3 at the most. So just because you're what you call a quarter one, it doesn't mean you're an early developer. Luke Shaw is a brilliant example of this. Luke was quarter four, the youngest boy at Southampton in his age group, but also the most mature boy in his age group at the same time. So a really good example of how maturity and relative age aren't always one and the same. But I think UK, the people in the clubs, particularly the clubs that are driving this area, and I particularly focus on likes of Bournemouth, I would say, Southampton, Arsenal, who really had a game in this particular area. United doing a lot of good work in this area as well. There's some incredibly bright practitioners working in those areas who really know the subject matter inside out. And it's those individuals who are really driving the improvements in practice in this area. The scientists, we're kind of trying to catch up with them now, so and working with them, which has really been quite useful. But I think UK, when it comes to growth and maturation, yeah, we're well ahead of the field, and the Premier League academies are definitely ahead of the game in many areas. We used to be behind, but now we're definitely ahead, which is great.
I think Ben, you'll probably agree. I think that's really good to hear. And it's interesting you mentioned in other sports as well in terms of ballet and things. And you mentioned Des Ryan earlier in the work he's doing with the GAA. We were in Dublin earlier this year, and I was speaking to Des on this exact topic. Because we know, you know, thinking of rugby as well for another example, but GAA, you know, really physical sports. This is obviously a really, really big topic and something which is incredibly beneficial. Have you seen other sports such as rugby and the uptake on, biobanding or growth and maturation, trying to match age groups for biological age?
If there ever was a sport that should be considering biobanding, it should be rugby. But they seem to be quite resistant towards it. There are a couple of the smaller nations, Scotland being one of them, who are definitely interested in the concept and are tracking growth and maturation across their academies and the regional development programs very, very closely, and doing it very well as well. Some academies, I would say, down south are assessing growth and maturity, but probably not using the best methods and really not doing that much with it. With the Scots, I was up there recently with Des for a discussion workshop on age banding and exploring the kind of topic. And in their under 15s, they had, it was about a sample of about 580 kids. Out of 580 kids, there were only 2 late developers in the entire sample. That shows you there should have been about 90 on the basis of a normal population. The biggest kid in that age group was about 130 kilograms. The smallest kid in that same age group was about 38. So you're talking about 3 to 4 times size difference, etc. And yeah, rugby's meant to be a game for all shapes and sizes, but 130 is a little bit different from 38. And so there's undoubtedly a need for sports such as rugby to do a better job in that area. Obviously, New Zealand have done an excellent job with their age and their weight banding. What they have is they have a system where you've got an age group, but if you are of a smaller size, you can play in an age group, but it's restricted to kids of a certain size. And the reason being is that the Polynesian and the Maori children will mature in advance of the white kids there as well. So for those smaller kids, those late developers, you really need that weight-restricted division for them to survive in the system. And they're allowed to continue up to about the ages of 16, and then hopefully by that time they've grown, they've developed, and they're able to compete against the other kids. But there's been a couple of really interesting studies there that suggested that those kids in the restricted age groups, if it wasn't for those restricted age groups, they would not be playing rugby. There was a fascinating study too as well, came out from Economist, and they showed in the New Zealand rugby that those players who were forced to play up because they were particularly big, they were more likely to drop out. But the problem is that they were only probably about 1%, 0.5% of the overall population. The kids who were in the weight-restricted divisions in comparison to the normal age groups, they were actually more likely to stay in. But when you consider that that was about 40% of the kids, well, yeah, actually, the overall net benefit of the program was really, really beneficial. And, New Zealand have been producing players as a relatively small nation and dominating that game for a long, long period of time. And I think certainly when dealing with that particular population that they have, I think it's undoubtedly a good strategy. You see similar things with Pop Warner, American football, where they have limits on size and which positions you can play as well, but also age banding for playing up and down. So again, those types of contact sports where size is going to be important, it needs to be taken into account. The GAA in Ireland with Des, and much credit to Des for his work in this area, they've started biobanding in the hurley, they've started biobanding in the Gaelic football as well. And what's been fascinating, there's some really good videos online about this, and they interview the kids afterwards, they're saying exactly the same as what we found with the boys in the football. The early developers are having to work more upon technique. There's a better learning experience for them. And those late developers are getting more chance to actually own the game for once and command the game, which is beneficial. And again, not a replacement for the age group, something that sits alongside it and can help you hopefully identify some of that talent going forward.
Brilliant information, that, Sean. I also think with this, and I know Jordan's experienced this, that I think a lot of clubs will see the pattern and they'll get uptaken a lot more by a lot of clubs, won't it, as more examples come out, like you've both mentioned already. I think some of the stuff you mentioned around language, because when we're hitting these barriers at clubs where there'll be people that disregard it straight away, there's logistic issues and all the rest of it, and the playing up, playing down, it makes sense to me to change that language, because for a child, I suppose that can be quite a negative thing, can't it, for you to be essentially playing down. So the playing across age groups, I think that was one thing that people can definitely take away from it, because it just removes that, doesn't it? And removes that, it makes it more about the development. It makes it more about the development of that individual rather than moving up and moving down. I just wanted to highlight that because I thought that was a really important point that you made before.
Yeah. Just to add to that, I think Amy Spencer at Southampton's done a fantastic job of actually addressing the psychological aspect of playing up and playing down. In Southampton Bioband, they go into 6-week phases of biobanding, and what they do is they actually align the sports psychology support for it. So all those early developers, they're taught about failure and how it is to fail, because all of a sudden they're going to be failing and failing big, and they got to be able to cope with that failure. And it can be challenging if you've never failed before at all, but it's a really necessary skill that you're going to have to learn and develop at some point of time. I don't know if any of you saw the Crystal Palace documentary, but I think it was the first episode where those three boys, one was a late developer, one was on time going through the growth spurt. The other lad was, and he thought he was an ex-Mbappe. He looked a wee bit like Mbappe as well. He's a really, really good player, but he was getting a wee bit cocky, a bit big for his boots, and they played him up, and boy, yeah, he struggled. In that kind of situation, Amy Spencer at Southampton, she would have been educating him on, okay, this is how to deal with failure. And right enough, it took a couple of sessions, but the coach kind of jumped in and took the boy aside and told him how to deal with it. But just aligning the sports psychology support for the early developers, and then for the late developers, saying, okay, you're going to be the commander of this game. This is what Southampton call it. They call it command and challenge. The late developer becomes the commander. You've been the weak link in the team. You're the smallest guy. You're probably the one who's least likely to be the leader in their age group. All of a sudden, you're the oldest boy. You're going to be the leader. This is how you lead. This is how you communicate. This is how you mentor. And they're pulling stuff from research and education, looking at mixed age classrooms where you get exactly this. The older kids become the mentors for the younger kids. The younger kids who would be our early developers are striving to be like the older kids who are our late developers. And just having that kind of experience of consolidating one's learning through mentoring and teaching, but also striving to be like the other kids, being pushed a little bit harder. It's a fantastic experience for the kids. And I think this is why a lot of the clubs, really appreciate it. And this is the nice thing as well. Like when we first did biobanding, we just created the biobands and threw the kids in there. We didn't know what was going to happen. But the clubs, well, some of the sports psychologists were really, really negative about it because they felt we were ignoring psychology. We weren't ignoring psychology at all. And in fact, psychological factors were some of the most important things to come out with it. But a lot more progressive, forward-thinking sports psychologists came along and said, no, we actually have a really important role here. We need to prepare those kids for the new challenges. And that's where, clubs such as Arsenal, Southampton have really kind of taken that concept and developed it so much further. In fact, Arsenal take a very systematic approach to their biobanding now, a very multidisciplinary group that approaches to it as well. And a very successful club.
It ties really nicely. Sorry, Jordan.
No, go on after you. You go.
I was just going to say it ties really nicely into an episode we did a couple of podcast we did a couple of episodes with, and that was around social support for players and putting them in environments that test them. So a player that's maybe a bit quieter in the age group, putting them in more of a leadership role, taking a warm up or making them captain or something like that. And this crosses over into that, doesn't it? Where if you've got a player that's going to be top of their age group, scoring a lot of goals and not really physically tested, you're putting them in a position that's going to challenge them. It's only going to develop them more. Mm-hmm. Go on, Jordan, what were you going to say? Sorry.
No, I'm actually glad you said that, because that's exactly what I was going to talk about, the psych side of things. And that's obviously what we saw at Bournemouth. It's what we saw whenever we played games, regardless. And I think, Sean, I'm sure we'll back this up. But when people think we're talking about growth maturation and biobanding, we're trying to, keep the later mature players in the system, and we're just forgetting about the early maturers. But the challenges you actually saw for the early maturers, I remember we had a game against QPR, a striker who was banging goals in his normal age group for fun, suddenly playing against two centre halves who were bigger than him, and that was not normal for him. And all of a sudden, he was had a tough day at the office, but a brilliant challenge for him, and he came through it and did really, really well. And I spoke to him because I was watching the games, and literally as he walked to the pitch, I spoke to him. How do you find that? I went, "Oh, that was brilliant. That was brilliant." Usually he's scoring hat tricks every week, or 4 goals, and this time he's had a real tough day. Managed to score 1 in the end, but he loved it. And I think if more clubs can see that, and this is where I was trying to allude to earlier, Sean, but I want to know what you think, your opinion of the future of biobanding and growth and maturation, tracking, monitoring, testing, widespread. Do you think it's going to take that sort of thing for those examples to get the word out a bit more? Because down on the south coast, like you say, it was great for us. We had Southampton just down the coast. We could do lots of biobanding fixtures, tournaments with. We had a little triangular with Arsenal and Southampton and Bournemouth involved, and it was great for us. But do you think to get it bigger, we need more education and more of those examples?
I think if you can get the examples and the players coming through, and that the clubs who are taking this type of approach are having the most success in terms of translating players up to the top level and identifying those potential late developers that might have been cut from the programme, and you see the success of those clubs, then the other clubs start to pick up their ears. And it's a case of having those conversations with people as well, finding out, keeping an open mind to things, not just saying, oh yeah, it's a lot of nonsense, not actually exploring the whole concept inside out, and seeing it, trying it out. And if it doesn't work for your club, then that's perfectly fine. That's okay. You move on from it. But I think it's a case of it will sell itself in the long term. If we look at, say, for example, the futures programs out of Belgium, which are more national kind of biobanded programs, the sort of a development of the futures programs across a range of different nations now is very much down to the success of the Belgian team. Now, you look at Belgium as a country, Belgium is about the same size as Scotland, but they're one of the top ranked teams. They don't have one of the best professional leagues in soccer. Why on earth are Belgium doing so well? One of the reasons they've been had so much success is because of this futures program, which is what they did in this program is they identified late, on time, and early developers. They took them together to our national tournaments, and they basically biobanded. They had all the late developers over in one pitch. They had the on-time kids here and the earlys over there, and they could identify those players who had what they call the futures quality. So the kid who's never giving up, who's got that competitive edge, who's working as hard in game 1 as they are in game 4. The kid who's got technical skills, got tactical awareness. The kid who has got sort of creativity, learning skills, good adaptive learning skills, a good problem solver. But a kid who's also got physical potential. They might be a relatively small late developer, not fantastic in their age group, but when they're with the other late developers, they're one of the strongest, they're one of the fastest, they're one of the most powerful. And crikey, think what they're going to look like when they actually go through the growth spurt. And when you see programs like that develop players such as Dries Mertens, Courtois, De Bruyne, and all of a sudden you see Belgium just going from nowhere to being at the top of the FIFA rankings, you start to think, okay, something's going on here in terms of unearthing that talent. Because for those late developers to survive in the system, they might not be the best player in their age group, but they've got to have something incredible, technical, tactical, psychologically, just to survive. And eventually that growth will come. And it might not be until 20, 21 years of age, but eventually it will come. And that's when you see those other attributes really start to shine through. Now, Denmark have taken up their futures program. I believe they have 4 or 5 futures players now on their national squad, and that's much down to Rasmus Porsche, who's been doing the work there. We work quite closely with Rasmus. And then you've got the Swedes too. So the Swedes have started their biobanding or their futures program. And so Tommy Lundberg there, I think they have about 50% of the current under-21 squad are coming from their futures program. And they've had their first futures program players actually start to go into the national team as well. The Dutch are looking at it, the Poles, the Czechs, the Irish are looking at it. And I know from my conversations, the projects we're starting with the Scots, is that we're starting to look at it as well, because if you are a small nation, if you make that mess up in that one player, it's huge because you don't have that many players to pick from. If you're a big nation, well, you can throw as many eggs against the wall and you'll always be able to field a half-decent team. But for those small nations, they need to be absolutely on the ball when it comes to picking. This is the same thing with Ireland and Scotland and the rugby. They have to be absolutely on the ball because we're pulling from a lot less players than England or France will be. So we need to make those decisions more effectively than them. So this is where these types of futures programs can be incredibly beneficial. And I think that's kind of where the future is going in terms of at the national level with regards to the sport. With regards to the Premier stuff, I think it'll continue to develop. The clubs will develop as they find out the challenges, the weaknesses, the potential benefits of the program, and they'll fine-tune these programs over time. I think from a research perspective, we're interested in looking at some more of the things such as passing networks and game dynamics and performance in game to look at how biobanding is changing. I know Will Abbott's done some really nice work down at Brighton, looking at biobanding, finding it's producing a more technical, tactical oriented game with a lot more shorter passing rather than just kind of classic punt and rush type stuff. But I think then, I think there's still a lot more work to go on in that particular area. But I think it's here to stay with many of the clubs here in England. They're definitely getting the benefits of it, and they're definitely sort of producing some of the talents, and it'll only grow from strength to strength, I think.
Yeah,
Jordan, I want to direct this at you. Okay. With your recent experiences. So when you biobanding, obviously the players are playing, they're going into an age group, they're playing with their team. But for you, Jordan, as a perspective recently at a club working with an age group, if you've got players, we're going to use the term up and down again, playing up and down. Yep. How does that impact your work that you're doing away from the pitch in terms of the gym work? Are they still just coming back as a squad?
No, so yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think it's mostly for games that they're probably doing that. And as I said, some of the clubs will do their training, But you'll just be doing the same training, but with a different type of group, I suspect, with maybe different focuses and objectives. If you look at Arsenal, for example, when they do their bio-banding, every player has set a specific goal that they expect them to achieve, and the coach will be aware of that goal, and they will structure that bio-banded training session to make sure that each child is getting the opportunity to strive towards that particular goal, and that it would be emphasized. So not much is going to change in that regard. The difficulty is just getting kids in at different days that they're not used to, etc. I think that's probably the biggest challenge. I think in terms of taking kids away from training or taking away kids from competition from a bio-banded perspective, that's maybe more related to the work that David's done, for example, looking at injury reduction through the growth spurt, where we might reduce training load or we might adapt training content at a certain point of phase of development to reduce the risk of those growth-related injuries presenting. So that's probably where we would change things in terms of content.
Yeah, I think just following on from that, and you've hit all the nails on the head, really. I was directly following on from David's good work with that, and when you saw people with Severs and Oscars flaring up, it was easy to identify. But the beauty of it was you actually kind of trying to highlight them before any sort of pain kicked in, and then you were trying to get in there. So from an injury prevention point of view, I think this is essential personally. But I think the point you just said there as well, Sean, in terms of giving challenges to players who are moving across bands, not up and down. Mm-hmm. I think that was a key thing. And where, in my mind, when we sent out the questionnaires to all the parents, I wanted to include a question I wanted to make sure was in there and quite early on, so they definitely read it. Mm-hmm. Is the logistical side of things, aka a different training night, different time of training, mm-hmm. is that a problem for you? And I was expecting, quite a mixed response from that, 50-50. And I think we only got about, I want to say less than 10% saying, no, it's not a problem. And the rest of the responses were overwhelmingly positive, like I said at the start, because they could see the benefits. And I wanted to get the parents' perspective as well, because parents are a massive part of academy football, as we know. They're traveling up and down the country every single weekend, and taking their kids to training multiple mm-hmm. times a week. So it was really interesting that we got, we wanted to get the parents' perspectives on that. And again, like I say, they were, some of the answers we were getting were so eye-opening. And I think, like you say, that those challenge side of things and setting somebody who might not have necessarily been a striver in their group and somebody who's, really, taking the bull by the horns, all of a sudden, when they get put into their bio-band and they actually have that chance for a bit of leadership, like you said earlier, and the challenge gets set for them, we want you to be a bit more vocal on the pitch or whatever, they just feel a bit more comfortable because they're more with their peers, biological peers. Mm-hmm. And the benefits were there clear to see. I think just from my point of view, I'm going to shut up in a second. I think the procedures in place that clubs are starting to put in there, like you said, with Southampton with 6-week blocks, Bournemouth, we try and do at least one block every review period, so that when it came to review time, retain release decisions, we had a chance to look at players in their normal chronological age groups and see if they were doing well or struggling a little bit. But then we also got to see them in a bio-banded setting, so we could see actually this could be growth and maturation related issues, if you want to call it that might be affecting performance and things like that. So I think it's those procedures that once we get them right, things will really, really thrive. But I just want to, final thing from me, and then I'll shut up. I just wanted to hark back to what you said, Sean, in terms of the national team and linking club to national team. Because anyone who's worked in an academy and had one of the academy players go to the national team, certainly England, I know Wales do it, Ireland do it, Scotland do it. The national setup will send documents through saying, can we have their recent loading patterns, GPS numbers if you've got them, any RPs, if they've been away, of the travel, the injury history, all that sort of stuff. The communication between club and country is quite strong. So in my mind, and the reason I'm asking this is that should be quite an easy link, and just an additional thing in there to say, we took his measurements 2 weeks ago, and he's 92.5% of his percentage adult height. He's what we might class as, red zone player, or just coming out of his growth spurt, potentially at risk of, Oscar's status disease or anything like flagging up. If that information is also going to the national team, then hopefully that conversation just becomes way more rounded, and we might see England, like you say, actually winning World Cups and becoming number one in the world ranking. So, that just twigs from my mind. But it'd be interesting to see, like you said, I'm really hopeful for the future of bio-banding and things like this. But
I've had conversations with Charlotte Cowie, who's the Chief Medical Officer for the FA, on exactly this subject matter. Previously, what was happening is that kids were coming up and they were getting measured in camp, and they were largely reflecting and using the maturity offset method, which is somewhat problematic when you work with under 16s, under 17s, particularly who are early developers, because the error in the method is quite substantial at that point of time. A number of the clubs were really good in terms of providing the maturity data. Some clubs would not provide that information, so it definitely made it challenging for them, I think, in terms of having that info. And it's really important to know, because you want to know where the kid is in their development. So if they are at the middle of a growth spurt, if they are growing incredibly rapidly, then you probably don't want to overload them, because then you're going to send them back to the club injured. Don't think the club's going to be sending you many future players if that's the case. So having that awareness definitely would be of great benefit to them. But the big challenge, I would say, when you look at, say, under 16s England, under 17s England, etc., those are just big early maturing boys. And again, if they go up against France, they have to play big early maturing boys, because France's boys are probably about 18. I remember with Dave Piggott watching, when he was with the FA, watching England under 16s, France under 16s, and he could have been sitting there watching a bunch of 18-year-olds playing, really, when it came down to it. Everybody was an early developer. And then the Brazilian under 16 squad rocked up, and they could have been a bunch of 20-year-olds. You know, they were huge, they were massive. The only kids at that tournament who looked normal were the Norwegians. They looked probably about 16, 17 or so. So you get these big selection biases, and a lot of the clubs will talk to me and say, look, you know, the national teams are picking the wrong boys. We've got much more talented boys, but often they're on time or they're late developers within our club, and they would love the opportunity for those players to be on, say, a futures team and get that kind of experience, so that maybe at 19 or 20, when they eventually grow, they're not just thrown into a national camp. They have actually been on a camp before. They've experienced what tournament football is like, and being part of a national kind of setup. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Swedes, the Danes, the Belgians are having so much success with it, is because it's an easy transition. These kids have done it before. Also, the national coaches know exactly what these kids are like as well, and they're playing a particular system too. So it just makes it so much easier to make that kind of transition. So some really smart thinking, and I think something that we could definitely improve upon. I guess one of the big challenges is that you've got the Premier League and then you've got the FA, and they're not one and the same. And of course, a lot of that information is the propriety of the clubs, owned by the clubs, etc. And you know, if you're passing it on to another organization, you have to be sure that, you know, no information is going to go about that anybody could find out about anybody else's players. And so that's definitely a concern I could see that the clubs might have. But for the benefit of the overall player, being able to share information, I think, would be an ideal sort of situation. That's what we're striving for with the Scottish FA, between the clubs in Scotland and with the Scottish FA, is to have a sharing of information so that it would be possible to identify and communicate between the organizations more effectively.
Brilliant. Amazing, yeah, really good.
John, have you got any other questions?
No, because we'll be here for another 3 hours, so I'll shut up now, honestly.
No, I think that the whole discussion around it, I mean, in terms of talking about the benefits, I mean, I don't think you can argue. I think there's like, you've used the examples, and again, when we were speaking before, and there's so many examples of players that have benefited from this. I suppose the real life scenarios of some of the challenges that coaches will come up against is some of the things, again, that you've mentioned, like the logistics. And I think some clubs just generally just being set in their ways. They don't want to change things, don't they? So I put this out to both of you just to wrap things up a little bit. But if practitioners are at a club and they're thinking this could really benefit us, I could see it working, how do they start that? I'll put it to you first, Jordan. How do they start that initial conversation to get things going? I know it can't be just something you click your fingers and you get in place straight away. But just a little bit of advice for practitioners if they're in a scenario where they feel like the club could be receptive to this. How would you start that process?
I think from my experience, and if we're looking at Cat 3 academies where you don't have all the staff and all the, you know, the infrastructure in place, sometimes the way we started to try and get the conversation when I was at Notts County and Lincoln as well, places like that, was through the injury prevention side of things. And when boys, and obviously the boys academy there, so when they're going through the growth spurt, and you say, well, if we can identify what's going on with these boys in their bodies, we might save them time on pitch. And, you know, if we can be proactive, they're going to have more time on the pitch, more development, hopefully going to become a better player. And that was the little, you know, hopefully cracking the door that then you go, oh, okay. And then from that, you can then talk about, well, actually, we could look at maybe playing players across age groups and things like that for better their development. And it's the whole holistic approach, I think, that you've got to go from it. If you go at it, straight in like a ball, like a china shop, and go, sports science is amazing, we're going to solve all your problems, what's going to happen. We know that as coaches. So it's probably looking at it, like you say, from the psych element, the development of the play and the technical tactical elements, but then obviously the physical and hopefully the injury prevention side of things, as well as Sean said earlier, boys going through rapid growth are more susceptible to injuries. So let's try and identify when they're going through rapid growth. That makes a lot of sense. So that would be my approach to it, just holistic thinking and being, tactful with who you speak to and how you speak to them, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd definitely speak to the people who are doing this well. So call up Perry Walters at Arsenal, TJ at Arsenal, for example, Sam Scott, Joe Brookman at Southampton, Ben Bradley. Find out about how they do it. You'll find that these clubs are incredibly open with regards to, the concept of biobanding and how they go about doing these practices. And they're generally happy to share a lot of insights, because the more people who are doing this, the more opportunity and competition they have in this particular area. And you'll get a lot more sense out of those individuals than you will outside of myself, because I don't work in a football club. I don't know how these things actually operate from a logistical perspective or a practical perspective. I can tell you a wee bit about the science behind it, but the people in the clubs are the people who will give you a better understanding and probably be much more convincing in terms of being able to talk to the potential benefits, or identify some of the challenges of running these types of things, how to do coach, parent education programs, etc., to make sure that everybody's on board. The one last thing I think I should probably add as well before I finish too is, particularly as a father of two daughters, is that the growth and maturity stuff, there's not a lot of stuff going on in the women's game just now. And I think that it is important that we start to do some research in that particular area. Stacey Emmond up at Leeds Beckett's doing some wonderful work with the FA, looking at growth and maturation as it relates to performance and selection in girls' sport. And I think we should encourage more work in that area. But probably the one where I think we've probably got a lot of scope for girls' sport to really benefit is in the ACL, MCL type risk of injury. If we look at girls in terms of MCL, ACL injuries, that risk only increases significantly in girls at the point of puberty. And it makes absolute sense, because those girls are going through puberty like the boys. They're putting on mass, but they're not putting on the same levels of strength as the boys are. So when they're twisting, turning, coming down, cutting, etc., there's large forces coming through the body, but they're not naturally getting those increases in terms of strength. So I think if we can have programs that, use things such as neuromuscular training to identify exactly when those girls are going through those growth spurts and try to mitigate that difference between gains in mass and gains in strength, then I think hopefully that could potentially play a really important role in terms of reducing the risk, because we know this is at that certain point that all of a sudden the inflection occurs. Prior to puberty, as I said, no difference between boys and girls. And this really underlines the importance of strength training for girls in football. And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy, that Paddy Roche, probably I'd argue he's one of the top S&C guys, and he knows his growth and maturation inside out. Certainly one of the top S&C guys in academy football. He's now moved over to the women's program at Arsenal, and I think that'll go a long way, because what he was implementing is very similar to what David was implementing at Bournemouth in terms of reducing the growth-related injuries at Arsenal. Slightly different way, but a similar concept in terms of identifying those players who are more at risk and adapting the training content and programs for them. And I think if we can take that kind of approach and apply it to the women's sports, and even though they're less resourced, I think there's still potential to have a lot of benefit in those areas. Then that can maybe go to a long way in terms of keeping those girls healthy through that point of time. So as I said, they probably need the S&C a lot more than the boys at that point, because the boys, they got testosterone on their hands, they get the natural benefits. So definitely more work needs to be done in the girls area here, I think, to better look at the potential benefits of biobanding. And we have done some biobanding with US soccer girls. They found exactly the same benefits as the boys. It really was quite fascinating. So definitely some opportunity for more research and investment in girls' sport too.
Brilliant point to wrap us up, Sean. I really appreciate that. I think that's been fascinating. I know we could talk about this sort of stuff all day, but hopefully the listeners have taken a lot away from that. I know you're a very busy man, and you've been flying around to all different places recently speaking, this is the obvious reason why. Well, if anyone wants to keep up with what you've got going on, if you've got any speaking engagements coming up, where would you direct them?
Twitter's probably the best place. So I joined Twitter about 2 or 3 years ago after a lot of badgering from my colleagues and PhD students. If anything, I just wanted to sort of promote some of the work that the students were doing and some of the work that the clubs were doing, but also to try and sort of stop some of these ideas that were coming out around the subject matter. There's a lot of misinformation around growth and maturation, particularly from folks studying things such as relative age effects, etc. And when you're seeing a lot of misinformation coming out online and social media relative to the work that you're doing, then naturally you want to be able to nip that into the bud. So I've been reasonably active, I would have said, on Twitter since then. I usually update when I'm going off to different places. I'm up at Bassam at the start of October, then I get a jaunt over to Portugal again for mid-October. But the wife gives us a little bit of a hassle for that. I think she wants to join me in a few of those trips, so I'll have to take her along.
I'm not surprised going over to Portugal. That's brilliant. No, Sean, thank you very much. And Jordan, likewise, thank you for your questions. And anyone down on the South Coast, keep an eye out for the Physical Performance Hub coming very soon, Jordan.
Yeah, I won't plug it too much yet.
I'll plug it for you. But no, lads, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I think there's been some great discussion there. And keep up the good work.
Cheers.
No worries.